Fined $500 for painting my door, I uncovered our HOA president, Sandra's hypocrisy. Her 6-foot fountain and shady finances were just the start. With my neighbor's support, we exposed her corruption in a packed meeting. You won't believe how we brought her down and took back our community. The morning had been perfect, one of those rare, calm Saturdays where everything seemed right with the world. I had just finished painting my front door, a vibrant shade of turquoise. The color wasn't a random choice. It was deeply personal, a nod to my late mother and her favorite scarf, the one she wore during some of the hardest times in her life. Every brushstroke felt like a connection to her resilience, her unwavering ability to find joy, even when things were bleak. I stood back to admire my work, feeling a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just a door, it was a piece of my soul on display. The sun hit it just right, making the color pop against the plain beige of my house. For the first time in a while, I felt like I was breathing new life into something that had grown stale. And then, the moment was shattered. A stark white envelope protruded from my mailbox. I didn't think much of it at first. Just another bill, maybe. But as I pulled it out and saw the bold, capitalized letters screaming urgent, HOA violation notice, a knot began to form in my stomach. I tore it open right there on the lawn, my fingers trembling more from annoyance than curiosity. The notice was short, but packed a punch. A $500 fine for unauthorized modifications. My eyes darted back to the door, then to the letter, and back again. Unauthorized, I muttered, my voice rising. My own door? Was this some kind of joke? The anger bubbled up fast and hot. I wasn't even inside my house before I grabbed my car keys and drove to the HOA office. My neighbors liked to joke that our HOA was more of a dictatorship, and Sandra, the president, was its iron-fisted ruler. She was one of those people who thrived on power. Her perfectly styled hair and icy smile were always present at community events, where she'd revel in announcing new rules like she was reading royal decrees. When I arrived, she was sitting at her desk, her frosty demeanor fully intact. She barely looked up from her computer screen as I walked in, but that smug smile? Oh, it was there. "Good morning," she said, in that syrupy sweet tone that somehow managed to sound both polite and condescending. I slapped the notice onto her desk. "Sandra, what is this about? A $500 fine for painting my front door?" She finally looked up, tilting her head slightly as if I were some confused child who needed guidance. "All exterior changes must be pre-approved by the HOA to maintain community standards," she said smoothly. "But the guidelines don't say anything about doors," I argued, my voice sharp. I read them cover to cover. Her smile widened, just a fraction, and that's when I knew I was in trouble. "You'd know if you read the fine print," she said, leaning back in her chair like she had just delivered some kind of wisdom. For a moment, I was too stunned to respond. Fine print? Was she serious? This wasn't a $1 million contract, it was my front door. "Sandra," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady, "this is ridiculous. There's no way a door color affects community standards." "Well," she said, her tone turning icy, "that's not for you to decide." I left the office, clutching the violation notice, my head spinning. The anger I'd felt earlier had transformed into something darker, heavier. This wasn't about a door anymore. It was about power, her power, and her need to wield it over everyone. The turquoise door wasn't just a home improvement project. It had become a battleground, and I wasn't about to back down. That night, I sat at my dining table with a stack of HOA documents, a steaming cup of coffee, and a growing determination to uncover the so-called fine print Sandra had smugly mentioned. The fluorescent light above flickered slightly, adding to the sense that I was about to dig into something darker than I anticipated. If she wanted to play games, I was ready to play, and win. The HOA regulations were a maze of jargon and legalese, clearly designed to confuse rather than inform. But I was stubborn, and with every line I read, my frustration mounted. Then, buried near the end of a section about acceptable community aesthetics, I found it. The clause about exterior changes requiring pre-approval. But here's the kicker, doors weren't explicitly listed. There it was, Sandra's supposed fine print, held together by nothing more than her creative interpretation of vague rules. Still, this wasn't enough. I needed something more concrete, something that could turn the tables. That's when I remembered Sandra's yard, her obnoxiously large, elaborately decorated fountain, the one that lit up at night like some Vegas sideshow, had always felt out of place in our modest neighborhood. Out of curiosity, I flipped to the section on landscaping. My heart raced as I read the bolded line: fountains, sculptures, and other permanent installations must not exceed 4 feet in height or disrupt the visual harmony of the community. Sandra's fountain was at least 6 feet tall, complete with cascading tiers and cherubs. And it wasn't just an eyesore. It was a blatant violation of the very rules she enforced with an iron fist. My frustration morphed into a simmering sense of injustice. If Sandra was going to fine me $500 over a door, what gave her the right to blatantly disregard the bylaws herself? My instincts told me this fountain wasn't the only skeleton in her HOA closet. That's when I started digging deeper. The HOA financial reports were publicly accessible, though they clearly weren't meant to be understood. They were a nightmare of intentionally vague entries, like community enhancements and operational expenses. But the more I combed through them, the more inconsistencies I found. Thousands of dollars marked as community improvements had no accompanying receipts or documentation. And then there was Sandra's name. Over and over, it appeared next to approvals, signatures, and checks. One particularly glaring entry caught my attention: $3,500 for landscaping, paid to a contractor whose business I couldn't even verify existed. My gut told me I'd just scratched the surface of something much bigger than door paint. Fueled by righteous anger, I knew I couldn't tackle this alone. The next day, I started talking to my neighbors. It didn't take much convincing. Stories began to pour out: excessive fines, arbitrary rule enforcement, favoritism, and even personal vendettas. One neighbor recounted how Sandra had fined her for parking her car slightly over the curb while ignoring another resident's broken-down truck that had been sitting on cinder blocks for months. Another said they'd paid a $200 fine for leaving their trash bins out for one extra day, only to see Sandra herself leave hers out over a long weekend. By the time we gathered in my living room, the room was buzzing with shared outrage and determination. It wasn't just me. This was a pattern, a reign of unchecked power that had gone on for far too long. Together, we decided it was time to hold Sandra accountable, not just for her hypocrisy, but for the way she had weaponized her position against the very people she was supposed to serve. We weren't just residents anymore. We were a united front. And Sandra had no idea what was coming. The evening of the HOA meeting felt electric. The room, usually half empty with bored residents scrolling on their phones, was now packed wall to wall. People who rarely showed up had come, word having spread about the mountain of evidence we'd uncovered. There was an energy of quiet anticipation in the air, like we were all collectively waiting for the curtain to rise on a drama we'd rehearsed in whispers and quiet anger. Sandra, however, was calm. Too calm. She strode in with her signature icy smile, her clipboard tucked under one arm, as if she was hosting another one of her dictatorial sessions. She barely glanced at the crowd, though even she had to notice how unusually large it was. Her confidence, or perhaps arrogance, was almost impressive. Almost. The meeting began with the usual formalities: attendance roll call, approval of minutes, and a droning update about landscaping budgets. But when the floor opened for community concerns, I stood holding the folder of damning evidence. My heart pounded, but I steadied myself. This was the moment we'd all been waiting for. "I have some serious issues to address," I said, my voice clear and firm, "and they concern the leadership of this HOA. Sandra's head snapped toward me, her smile faltering for the first time. "This isn't the time for baseless accusations," she said quickly, her tone sharper than usual. "Oh, it's not baseless," I replied, holding up the stack of documents for everyone to see. "For years, we've been subjected to arbitrary fines, selective enforcement of rules, and questionable financial practices. And the person at the center of it all is you, Sandra." A murmur rippled through the room, some people whispering in disbelief, others nodding in agreement. Sandra's face turned a shade paler, but she kept her composure. Barely. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, her voice tight. These are wild accusations." "Oh, really?" I said, flipping open the folder. "Let's start with the $3,500 payment for landscaping that went to a contractor who doesn't exist. Or how about the 6-foot fountain in your yard, which is a direct violation of the bylaws you claim to enforce?" Gasps erupted from the crowd. Sandra tried to interject, but I raised my voice, fueled by the collective outrage around me. "And let's not forget the altered bylaws, rules you've quietly changed to suit your own convenience, without board approval." Her calm facade cracked. "You have no authority to accuse me," she snapped, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "This is nothing but a smear campaign." "Oh, but we do," I said, reaching into the folder one last time. I pulled out the petition, signed by over 80% of the community. "This is a call for your resignation, effective immediately." The room erupted into applause and cheers. Sandra stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find a way to regain control. Before she could, someone else stood up, the former HOA treasurer. "I can confirm," he said, his voice steady and cutting through the noise. "Sandra altered the bylaws without board approval. I saw it myself before she forced me to step down." That was the final blow. Whatever fight Sandra had left in her vanished in an instant. The room, now fully against her, demanded action. People shouted for her to step down, to answer for her actions. For the first time, Sandra looked truly rattled. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit. She grabbed her clipboard and tried to make a hasty escape, but the crowd wasn't letting her off that easily. As she moved toward the door, a unanimous vote was called, right then and there. Sandra was officially removed from her position. She didn't stick around to hear the final tally. The last I saw of her that night was the back of her perfectly coiffed head as she hurried out the door, her heels clicking furiously against the tile floor. The room erupted into celebration. People clapped each other on the back, finally free from the reign of a tyrant. For the first time in years, the HOA felt like a community again, and as I stood there, surrounded by my neighbors, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. Sandra had underestimated all of us, and it cost her everything. With Sandra out of the picture, it was as if the neighborhood took a collective sigh of relief. The tension that had quietly simmered under the surface for years finally dissipated. The HOA, once a tool for enforcing Sandra's whims, was completely overhauled. The first step was rewriting the bylaws. This time, the process wasn't done behind closed doors or buried in confusing language. Instead, we held open meetings, inviting every resident to weigh in. What started as cautious participation quickly turned into a wave of enthusiasm. People who had never bothered to attend HOA meetings before now eagerly offered ideas and debated policies. It was refreshing, almost surreal, to see how much the community cared once they felt like their voices actually mattered. Transparency became the cornerstone of the new HOA. Financial records were published online, accessible to anyone who wanted to review them. Arbitrary fines were not only stopped, but refunded. I'll never forget the look of sheer joy on one elderly neighbor's face when she received a check for the $200 fine Sandra had slapped on her for having her trash bins out too long. For the first time, the HOA felt like it was working for the residents instead of against them. With each small victory, the neighborhood started to change. People began talking to each other more, helping each other out with little projects, and even organizing community events. The cold, stiff atmosphere Sandra had cultivated was replaced with something warmer, more vibrant. It was no longer just a collection of houses. It was a true community. And as for me, my turquoise door remained untouched. No one dared to challenge it after everything that had happened. In fact, it became something of a landmark, a quiet but bold reminder of the power of unity. Every time I walked past it, I felt a little lighter. It wasn't just a tribute to my mother anymore. It was a symbol of what happens when people come together to stand against injustice. Of course, the neighborhood still whispered about Sandra from time to time. After her abrupt exit, rumors flew faster than ever. The most popular one was that she'd moved to a sprawling estate in another town, a place where she could enforce her brand of perfection without resistance. Someone even claimed her new house featured a fountain so over the top it could be seen from the main road. Honestly, it sounded just like her, and in a strange way, it was fitting. Sandra had always loved her fountains, gaudy, unnecessary, and way too big for their space. It was poetic, really. She'd built her entire identity on control and appearances, and now she was stuck with the ultimate monument to her excess. As for us, we didn't need anything so grand to feel at home. The changes we made weren't about aesthetics. They were about fairness, respect, and reclaiming our neighborhood from the grip of one person's ego. And as I watched kids play in the street and neighbors laugh over shared stories, I couldn't help but smile. We'd turned the tide all right, and we weren't going back.